Welcome everybody. It's great to see you all again, and I'm very, very grateful to our two speakers tonight. And we'll run this as normal. So for those of you who've been to more than one, I know some people have been to quite a few. George Freeman and Nigel Slater will each talk for up to 10 minutes, and then we'll just throw it open to questions and conversation. And we will definitely finish by 7 because we're very rigid about that to make sure that people know that the commitment is an hour. And I think it's a really important topic tonight. George Freeman, for those of you who don't know him, is Conservative MP for Mid Norfolk. Known I didn't know this until I looked it up, but known as high-tech Hezza, but very, very appropriately, I think, George. Long involvement in life sciences, both before Parliament and in government. And I know also very strongly committed to regeneration and renewal, and that's particularly appropriate now, perhaps both post-Brexit and post-COVID, and particularly interested in the role of life sciences potentially in driving that renewal. Nigel Slater will be known to many people here tonight, Emeritus Professor of Chemical Engineering, Life Fellow at Fitz. Nigel was head of the Department of Chemical Engineering and Biotechnology and is a professor in Zhejiang in China as well. And Nigel, I think, is particularly understands the power of academia and industry working together and what that can deliver, how that can promote growth. So I think in different ways they come at the same topic from different angles, but you're both really welcome. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So George, over to you.
Sally, thank you. And thanks all of you for joining us tonight. I'm really worried that everyone is thinking they've joined a culinary event with George Foreman and Nigel Slater, and they were going to get recipes. So we're on our toes, Nigel, to keep this one lively. First thing, Sally, I'm just really conscious that nobody has been hit harder really this year than the young and students, particularly. My daughter's just started at Durham. My son's doing his A-levels, and it's just a joy to do something to help you build this digital community. And I can't think of any experience that would be more disrupted by a lockdown than being at university. The whole point is very close proximity, lots of interaction, lots of discovery, lots of all of that. And I genuinely, it's a pleasure to do anything to try and help lighten the darkness. What I'd like to do, Sally, is just try and folks, I can't see everyone. I'm on my mobile phone, so I can only see a few faces, but I know you're all there. It's just describe a little bit about the motivation and kind of why I ended up in politics and where I'm coming from, because I think that will, it's a question you should always ask about a politician. What's really the driving force? Because you have to be pretty mad to do this job, and everyone's got a driving force. So I'm going to disclose mine and why it drove me into science, because I'm not a scientist, and there is a reason for that. And it'll segue neatly into Nigel. And perhaps, Sally, then I can set out why I'm so evangelical about science and innovation as the cornerstone of proper UK recovery. So I start with the word recovery because my whole sort of life and mission has been shaped by some experience of the power of renewal and redemption and rehabilitation and recovery. And I was really great education has been the lifeline for me. What do I mean? Well, what I mean is I was taken out of the arms of my father when I was 11 months old by the police. And Dad had experienced the all too common sort of ups and downs of life. He'd been the Queen Mother's jump jockey. He'd got the beautiful girl, my mother. He won the Grand National, won the King George. He was on the top of his game. He was the Frankie Dettori or the AP McCoy of his generation. And 10 years later, bankrupt, alcoholic, depressed, head injuries. He lost his wife, his 3 boys, his life, all his horses, his reputation. And he spent 20 years in a council flat in Newmarket with a bottle of whiskey and a letter from the Queen Mum. And I was a ward of court, wasn't allowed to meet him. My mother remarried. I grew up on a farm, happy as Larry. And my mother wasn't. She never recovered and became quite a serious alcoholic. They divorced, and I lived in Cambridge as a teenager, which is where I met Alice, who's on the call. And so I was lucky. I was kind of rescued really by a very, very kind, my mother's stepfather. And he and my stepfather, my life's been shaped by step parents. And I think being a step parent's really hard. And if you ever meet a step parent, have a quiet word of thanks, because it's pretty thankless. And so I was packed off to great schools and ended up at the best university in the world. And if you ask my friends who knew me at Cambridge, they would have said, yeah, George will be an MP, but he'll be a Labour MP or a Lib Dem. And they'd be quite surprised probably. The reason for that is, as a young man and at university, it's an odd fusion really in me, which explains where I was really, really, I just couldn't abide, and I still can't abide, lazy privilege. And my father had been the victim of lazy privilege. The racing industry had used him and enjoyed him when they needed him, but there was no help when he was down. And that's an old Britain. It's sort of gone now, I think. I mean, it's still there a bit. So I had a sort of weird combination of rural, entrepreneurial. My stepfather had built his business from nothing and used to say to me, you can achieve anything you want in life if you're prepared to work hard enough. Be careful what you tell young people, because they tend to believe you. And a combination of that, this sort of absent sporting hero father, and a very traditional education packed off in a boarding school that really saved me. If I hadn't been there, I would have been in much more trouble at home. So I was a weird kid. I was the guy who used to go back to school early and say to my housemaster, could I come and stay with you, because it's home isn't great. So for me, there's been a deep sort of in me, a real belief that you can turn your circumstances around, and that actually there's a spirit. It's all about, and for me, sport and enterprise share that spirit. Whether you're the Scottish team trying to win the Calcutta Cup with 20 minutes to go, or an entrepreneur or a scientist, somebody with a dream on a mission, it's the same thing in the end, actually. And one of the things that Sally and I have been doing through the Big Tent Foundation, the Big Tent Festival, is celebrating that spirit. And we put the arts tent at Cambridge Babraham in 2019 festival next to the science tent, deliberately, because we're trying to suggest that the instinct to imagine, to dream, to work, to get somewhere better is common. It's shared, actually. And one of the things politics needs to do is rediscover that instinct. And, you know, I'm a terrible romantic. I look back at the great 1911 Liberal Conservative cabinets, and I look back at the great moments where democracy has risen to the challenge, from JFK to, actually, I think Blair in his early incarnation, I think even Thatcher in her early years. That sometimes democracy really does it. Obama did it, and it's not there now. I think it's really in a bad state. And for me, there's a spirit in politics that has got to be relearned, and it's that spirit of endeavor and discipline and teamwork and inspiring people as you go along, not by cutting corners and saying it'll all be easy. Actually, it's not very inspiring to have something very easy. What's inspiring is the victory against the odds. And that's good, because the odds are pretty high at the moment. There's a lot of people struggling. So I ended up leaving university, and I always knew what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to be an MP from the age of 12, but I just didn't think you could admit it to anybody, least of all my parents, who would have thought it was a sort of, you know, wastrel thing to do with your life. I needed to sort of build a business. And I ended up getting drawn. I mean, I would have shriveled up in the city. I would have hated accountancy. I mean, all the things that we were told to do when you left Cambridge. I remember sitting in the careers office and trying to make it say I could be a politician, and it wouldn't. And I think things have got better these days. I think there's a sense that you can, and indeed, if you can, you should try and find whatever your thing is in life and do it. And I ended up literally in 2003, I started a project called Mind the Gap, which was asking some big questions about how the gap between citizens and the elected had grown. And it became clear to me that the problem was actually in this country was on the green benches in Parliament, and that it was about that point that I decided I was going to stand. And I stood as a Conservative, really, because I just felt that my core belief is in enterprise, is in belonging, is in the importance of people having a sense of identity and a sense of belonging, and the relationship between civics and enterprise. And when I was elected in 2010, on the Osborne-Cameron ticket, as it were, I was the first person in the Treasury Support Group, which is the sort of group of MPs who work closely with the Chancellor, to suggest that we needed a growth strategy as well as a deficit strategy. And that was heresy, by the way. Literally, you could hear a pen drop. People looked at me like, is he one of us? So strong was the deficit message. And I wasn't weak on the deficit. I felt we ought to get the public spending under control. But my argument was, if we're really going to get out of the crash debt dilemma and really get off the kind of broken model of growth where we dump houses around the countryside, we have retail and consumer and city booms. If we're really going to build a more sustainable economy and grow prosperity for the next generation, we need to grow seriously. And my whole argument was, we've got to behave a bit more like a small business and think, where are the opportunities for Little Britain? We're not a military superpower. We're not a global superpower in the same way. Where have we got an opportunity? And to me, it was obvious. As the world develops rapidly and goes through industrial and agricultural revolutions in 30 years that we pioneered and have led over 300, the world's going to have to double food production in the next 25 years on the same land area with the same amount of water and energy. Millions of billions of people are going to go through the Laffer curve of needing medicines and the basics of life. We have an incredible opportunity in food, medicine, energy, in the appliance of bioscience, in a century that's going from essentially the 20th century, the century of physics. 21st century will be the century of biology and bioscience. And by understanding the systems of life, we have an incredible opportunity to literally develop for the world the systems of feeding, fueling, and healing those developing economies so they can go through a cleaner, smarter model of growth. And that's been my driving mission since I was elected. And I was lucky enough to meet David Cameron and persuade him when Pfizer were closing their research plant in 2010, which was a bit of a shock to the newly elected coalition. And I said, for goodness sake, don't go and try and prop it up, turn it into an incubator for small companies. Let's launch a bold industrial strategy for life sciences. The whole industry is changing. The $2 billion, 15-year, 80% failure rate to develop a drug that we can't afford to buy in the NHS is broken. The next model will be using genomics and informatics to target the drugs at specific patients and actually develop drugs around patients. And he asked me, well, what did you do before you came to Parliament? And I said, 15 years of biomedical venture capital investing. He said, okay, fine, carry on. And at the end of the 5-minute call, he said, you're hired. And I then became the government life advisor on life sciences. We set out a seminal industrial strategy. We launched Genomics England. We launched NHS Digital, and then nothing happened. And then he made me minister. And it was a dream. In 2014, I found myself the first ever minister for life science at Department of Business and Health, insisting that as an aging economy, the structural deficit in healthcare was going to bankrupt us unless we got our life science and our NHS sector pumping together. The NHS supporting research with data and tissues and pulling innovation through more quickly to drive up productivity, and the life science sector focusing a bit less on making expensive drugs we can't afford, but using its genius to help us manage down the cost of disease through earlier detection. Then Brexit struck, and I was fired to make way for 10 Brexit ministers. And I spent 3 years setting up the big tent with Sally, writing a book called Britain Beyond Brexit, generally making a nuisance of myself as a sort of a rejected Remainer. Boris brought me back in last year, much to my surprise, actually, to go to DFT to shake up the stale silos of an old-fashioned department. Extraordinary place. You bump into people in the lift and they say, I'm in roads, or I'm in aviation, or I'm in shipping, or I'm in rail. And I realized after a few weeks that nobody's really in transport, which is moving people from place to place. So we set out a future transport industrial strategy. Then I was fired by Dominic Cummings in February. The Prime Minister was on the call, but I was clearly, Cummings was working down the list. And I was very, very just not prepared to endorse no deal. I was prepared to endorse Brexit, given my constituency voted 62% for it. But my argument was, it was a mandate to leave the political union, not the single market. And we must stay close culturally, scientifically, and economically. So I'll just wrap up by saying, I'm still at the same message. I'm still, I think if the Prime Minister and Chancellor really wanted to, there's an opportunity for us to massively invest in science and research innovation, of course, isn't just pure science. We need to connect our science base better to our city. I mean, if you looked in from space, you'd say, amazing Britain. It's got this incredible science base and this unbelievable city of London. The two hardly talk to each other.
Yeah.
And the ecosystem is nearly there, but not quite. If we really connected them, and thirdly, used our aid and trade legacy around the world, we could really start to drive technology transfer. What do I mean? I mean, if we've got tariff freedom outside the EU, and I've debated Jacob Rees-Mogg ad infinitum on this, don't go to zero tariffs for everyone. Yes, it's criminal that we charge in the EU, Africa, 40% food tariffs. Let's go to 10%, provided you're not developing food that's inhumane or cruel or poisonous. But 0% only for those who are using the best technologies to develop, to produce food in a carbon-friendly way, in a low plastic way, in a low water way. So use that tariff to encourage progressive production, and then use your aid budget to help do technology transfer. And if we picked a few places around the world, I'd give you Kenya, where we're #1 foreign direct capital. We have a massive aid program, massive military, big military presence, but we're letting China turn a blind eye to the poachers and invest in the roads and the railway and steal all the minerals. We could develop a really rich development partnership, I think, where we double the aid, double the security, 10x the trade, and make Kenya a former Commonwealth partner of ours, a former colonial subject of ours, a partner in progressive growth, drought-resistant crops, digital health, smart energy systems, make it a hub for UK technology leadership, and it would drive inward investment into the UK, exports out. Much more importantly, I think it would give us a sort of 20-year model of growth. How did Little Britain go from post-crash debt, decline, depression? And the answer would be they really unleashed the power of their science and technology. But the biggest win is it gives the next generation hope that Britain's not over, and that we can put the Union Jack on hope and take that around the world while Russia and China trade in other things. We're the good guy. And I think it's very exciting, and we could do it. And with people like Nigel, we've got the science base to do it. I just think we've lacked the political vision. And I think actually the Prime Minister gets it. And so I'm totally devoted this year to trying to make sure that we get that over the line, because it could, I think, be very exciting for your generation.
Well, on that optimistic note, George, thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Nigel. Over to you, Nigel.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you this evening. I can see many old friends out there, and that's an added pleasure for me. So welcome. Yeah, I've come at this from a slightly different viewpoint. For me, the development of the COVID vaccines in less than a year and getting them into people has been an absolutely phenomenal achievement, and one that I never thought that I would see. Now, and that made me think, well, what's different now from when I started my career? How have the life sciences progressed over those 43 years? And there are a number of things. Obviously, there have been big scientific advances. We've got better methods, better equipment, better materials, and that. But that's all very techie. I don't really want to be techie this evening. What I want to look at are some of the other things as how the field has changed. So I began my career in biotechnology in the late 70s, and it was purely by accident. Biotechnology was a new field at that time, very new. Very few people knew anything about it. So it was put to me, look, Nigel, as a young academic, nobody here knows anything about biotechnology. We think it's going to be big. You don't know anything either. So you're as well equipped as anybody else to get going. And that was the best bit of advice I had in my entire life. And I have never regretted what might seem to have been a very naive decision to take it. Now, so it was really by virtue of the fact that I was unqualified that I got involved in the first place. I then spent roughly half my career in academia and the other half in industry, in multinationals, in SMEs, and in little tiny startups. And it was both aspects of that career were fascinating. And I'm really glad that I was able to do both. A large part of my work is really manufacturing for biologicals, and particularly biologicals for drugs. That's what my career has been around. And when I first started, the concept of using proteins, nucleic acids, viruses, cells for therapies was completely new. People weren't doing it, and a lot of people were very, very skeptical. I can remember a research director saying to me that he thought there was no commercial future at all for biological drugs. He said, for example, monoclonal antibodies. Well, we'll just use them to map the epitope. And once we've mapped the epitope, we'll develop a small molecule drug that'll be a lot cheaper, and we won't need the biologicals. So one fight we had was actually with our own company to give a commitment to biotechnology and biological drugs. It turns out that he was completely wrong. Monoclonal antibodies, which were invented in Cambridge, have been immensely successful. We always knew that to move forward, we wanted a success somewhere in the industry. Something had to succeed. It didn't really matter if it was us or not. When the tide comes in, all the boats rise. We just wanted a success. Monoclonal antibodies were a success, not for Wellcome, the company I was in, because they disinvested of Campath 1H, which went on to be a £1 billion drug. But the achievement, to put this in context, the achievement of AstraZeneca and the other vaccine manufacturers in bringing a vaccine to market, discovering it, developing it, and having it approved in less than a year has been absolutely phenomenal. If someone had said to me only months ago that that would be possible, I would have called them completely mad. But it's happened. They've done it. And I think to me that means that the field biotechnology has come of age. If we can do that, then we can do anything technically. I think that's great. And the fact that it was done by industry collaborating with academia makes it even more powerful. People always wondered how I managed to move from academia to industry and back again. And actually, it was very easy. They say to me, oh, it must be very different. Well, it's not different. As an academic, if I want to write a good paper, I've got to do good science. In industry, if I want a good product, I've got to do good science. What's the difference? So bringing these two together to make a successful vaccine, I think, has been phenomenal. But I think it goes a lot deeper than that. I'll tell you another story. Around 2000, I was on a BBSRC committee, and one of the other members was the research director of what was then Zeneca Agrochemicals. And I went to his office, and he showed me on his desk. He had it on his desk. He said, this is a tin of tomatoes that we've genetically engineered to give vastly improved processing characteristics. And he was obviously very, very proud of this achievement, and rightly so. From a scientific viewpoint, it was a groundbreaking development. But on the side of the tin, it was written in big letters, made from genetically engineered tomatoes. And I thought at the time that's a bit risque. So they launched this product. And within a few weeks, they had to cancel the launch because nobody was buying it. Everybody thought it was a monster food. And it was the words genetic engineering that turned people off. The other day, I had my vaccination. I had the AstraZeneca. They tell you which one you're having. I had the AstraZeneca vaccine, and that is a genetically engineered virus.
Yeah.
So we've moved from people not eating a food because they think it's a genetically engineered monster to situations where nobody thinks twice about having a genetically engineered virus injected into them. And why is that? And that's because the scientists developing the vaccine were completely open. The media was very enthusiastic about telling people what the science was. You go to dinner parties, well, you don't go to dinner parties now, but if you did.
Go to Zoom conversation. Yeah.
If you did, you'd hear everybody talking about viral spike proteins.
Well, in Cambridge.
I've got 3 kids, none of them are scientists, but they
say,
talk
yeah.
about viral spike protein. They know the difference between an RNA vaccine and a viral vector vaccine. That's how far we've come. And that's why people now are queuing up, delighted to get their vaccinations. So I think that's a big improvement. I think there's also going to be enormous steps in agri-biotech and for the Cambridge region, and particularly for the region in the region to the east and northeast of Cambridge. This is going to have an enormous effect. We're seeing improved crops. We're seeing ways forward to sustainable intensification. And all this needs a great variety of skills. It needs genomics, genetics, agronomy, plant breeding, all the biological skills, but it also needs big data, robotics, and automation, nutrition, and the whole business of translating science into practice. It's going to make a big difference. In the early 90s, I was a governor of the BBSRC Agricultural Engineering Research Institute that was at Silsoe. They did some fantastic work. They always used to treat me as a bit like the lad down from the town, and I was never quite sure whether they were serious or not. But overall, they did some fantastic work. But then they were shut down because they weren't able to translate that science into practice. What's the benefit to farmers if they don't know about it? Recently, those very same things are now top of the list for research priority. So things like robotics for harvesting crops. They were harvesting mushrooms with robots in the 1990s. Image recognition, so that you could just dose herbicides and weed killers on precisely in the field. You use far less, and there's far less of a burden environmentally. And using aerial imaging, they didn't have drones, but they used satellites to aerially image fields so they could work out which area of a field was most productive. That's going to happen now, but this time, instead of just writing learned papers, we need to get it out there in practice in the fields. Finally, and I will shut up now, finally, Cambridge is a great place to do this. The life science ecosystem around Cambridge is enormous. It's not known very well, but Cambridge addresses have more patents than the 6 next cities in the UK, added together, not individually. There is an enormous amount of innovation in Cambridge, and there's an enormous amount of life science innovation. So it's the place to be. It's going to grow. I am very, very, very bullish. I think this is an industry that's on the up. The teething problems have been sorted out, and it's going to move forward very rapidly.
Thank you, Nigel. I've got quite a lot of questions. I'm going to try and whiz through as many as we can get through in the time that we have. The first one actually comes out of what you, well, I mean, both of you, to be honest, are Cambridge enthusiasts, clearly, and you know, absolutely right. The life science ecosystem is obviously incredibly strong here. So we've got a question here about north-south divide. I suppose I'd pitch it slightly differently in a sense. How do we take the experience of Cambridge and learn from it, replicate it, try and encourage similar ecosystems to be developed in parts of the country that are considerably less favourable to it at the moment? So let me start with you, George.
Great question. And it was one of the things as minister I was passionate about. The first thing I did was to go to Northern Ireland, South Wales, Scotland to signal that life science doesn't just mean the Oxford, Cambridge, London triangle. There are centres of excellence all around the country. and we need to keep investing in them. But the distinctive bit about Cambridge is the cluster, as Nigel just talked about, and understanding what really drives a cluster is key. There's been oodles of academic work done on it. I think most of it rubbish, actually, in my experience. Really, a cluster, I think, is, and I attribute my very good friend and former chairman, Andy Richards, with this one. The best definition of the cluster is a low-risk place to move your family to pursue a high-risk career. And Cambridge is a successful cluster because it's a fabulous place to go and move a family. And if your biotech company goes bust, doesn't matter, there's another one. And the level of recycle is huge. But as an investor, I tried to take companies to Scotland back in the 90s. Scotland doesn't pass that test. If you're a biotech company on the Glasgow Science Park, if it goes down, there isn't a whole lot, there isn't enough capacity. And I think one of the challenges for government is, in this £100 billion levelling up agenda, how do we make sure that we really understand what makes a cluster work and try and create the conditions in which clusters can take shape? So I'll give you an example. In hydrogen, there is a real opportunity to do green hydrogen off the North Sea and Irish Sea wind farms. But rather than do it everywhere, we need to create a few hubs, hydrogen hubs, cities that are doing all the vehicles, the ports, and they become a centre of excellence in hydrogen. And you then create a cluster. People will go there because there's a lot going on. And I think creating some concentrations is key. And one of the things this country's done really badly, we tend to fiddle. We do technocratic tinkering. We chuck money at everything and back nothing. And although I disagree with Dominic Cummings about many things, actually, I think the DARPA, or ARIA, as it's called, because it doesn't have the defence funding, putting some money behind some really big British science ideas and backing them properly, I think is very exciting. And that's another way we could decentralise. It doesn't all have to be done in Cambridge. We could do it all, and we should do it elsewhere.
Nigel, I want to come to you for a different question, actually, if I can, which is really around students, which you've got so much experience of. One of the questions isn't there, but it's something I wanted to ask you, is what would you say now to somebody thinking about what should they do with their future, whether they've obviously, if they've studied sciences, then particularly relevant, but actually even in a wider range of subjects, what would you say to them about the future? And to what extent are you concerned post-Brexit about attracting students and young scientists, I guess, to the UK, or do you think the vaccines experience will help in that?
Yeah. Well, in my own experience, I've for the last 3 years before I retired, I ran a master's in bioscience enterprise, and we'd have 25 youngsters, probably about late 20s. Some of them had post experience, and we were teaching them really the rudiments of how you exploit the life sciences. And these kids were absolutely fantastic. I didn't have to teach them at all, really. They came highly enthusiastic. They got incredible backgrounds. They weren't all life scientists. We had lawyers, we had a lot of medics, we had patent attorneys, and they were really keen to pool their expertise and their experience. They worked together in teams in a phenomenal way. And they all did fantastic pieces of work. They left, got wonderful jobs, and they're highly enthusiastic about their careers. So I'm really not worried at all about students. They're up for it, and they will make they have great careers. I was involved. Well, I actually chaired the East of England technology audit in 2017. Yeah. And we toured around the region, having lots of open meetings and encouraging people to tell us things. And some very interesting things emerged. One of them was exactly like George said. If you've got a cluster with lots of companies in it, all doing life sciences, the career risk of your employer going under is really tiny, because you just move to the next one. And I saw this recently with one of my postdocs. He was made redundant from company on the science part. Within weeks, he was in another company on Granta Park, better off actually. So it's not really a risk, it's safe. Yeah, no, I am very, very bullish as well for the youngsters. The other thing that came up, I don't want to push this too far, but somebody made the comment that it was a bit disturbing that most of the senior people in biotech companies are old. And when I looked around at the people I knew, I had to agree. Yeah, that's true in my experience. Why don't we get some youngsters in with a bit of vision and a bit of energy? That would be tremendous. So I think there's things we can do, and yeah, I'm very optimistic.
Thanks, Nigel. I think this one's, well, I don't know, I think it's mainly, I think I'll start with George anyway. The link between academia and venture capital, is it sufficiently strong and dynamic? Could there be a government-backed intermediary between academia and private capital? So that's the question. The thing I'd like to add from stuff I've been involved in the past is, where is the funding for one stage up? So you've got the angel funding and you've got the funding for big companies, but what about that stage post-angel that always seems to me to have been a real gap in the UK economy? So let me start with you, George.
Yeah, great question. So my career was in the early stage, and I think there's a lot of rubbish actually talked, and unfortunately in government where people don't understand the sector that well. I mean, there are people who do, but it's not common. It's very easy to be persuaded in government, oh, we must put some money into the early stage. Actually, early stage in the UK is really good, very vibrant. There's about 6 billion has gone into the EIS scheme. Finding angels and seed money isn't hard. The key is scale up.
Yeah.
And to your point, Sally, and one of the things I've been working on with number 10 and 11 is, if we're going to achieve this vision of science to city to global, how do you get that science to city ecosystem going? And well, here are 3 thoughts. The first is, we need to create an environment where the early stage investors are really incentivized to hold on and build a company through to scale up. And at the moment, it's you're quite incentivized to get rid of it reasonably quickly. Secondly, so I would have 0% capital gains tax on technology stocks that you've held for over 8 or 9 years, say. Secondly, in the mid-cap investor market, similarly, I mean, I used to work in a fund, typically 10-year carried interest funds. At about 8 years, you start trying to raise the money for the next fund. And if you haven't got an exit, you're going to chase it pretty fast. And again, we need to encourage those investors to build through and scale up. The real key is our pension funds. So the vast majority of our savings in this country is in pension funds. Does anyone know what percentage are invested in equities, or even what percentage are in private equity? It's tiny, and there's a deep flaw in the way our pension funds are investing and how they're scored. It goes back to the Treasury actually, and I think one of the exciting things about this year, to Nigel's point, and vaccine success, is I think there's a retail opportunity. I think if you said to people, would you like to put your PEP or your ISA, your pension, not all of it, but have an exposure to backing British science, I think people are excited in a way that they wouldn't have been before. So there are some things we can do. The key is scale up. We're really good at starting up. And the Scale Up Institute in Cambridge is doing great work. And if we get this right, you know, we can stop the tradition of starting great companies and selling them to the Americans to commercialize, and actually finance them here. And if you do the aid and the trade bit, we could build an export business here as well. One of the reasons we tend to sell early is that we haven't got the domestic market, and we've been a bit parochial. And so tackling that globalization is key.
Absolutely. Nigel, anything to add to that?
Well, no, I agree entirely. I think scale up is the big issue. This country desperately needs some big companies, technology companies, on the London Stock Exchange. If you look at how the FTSE 100 has moved since the 1st of January last year, and how the Nasdaq has moved, well, the Nasdaq is about 60% ahead of the FTSE. And the difference is we don't have those high growth companies listing in the UK, and we need them. So it's that scale up that I think needs to be tackled.
Yeah, thank you.
I looked at the data, Sally, before coming on. 50% of American pension funds are in equities, of which about 23 or 4 is in early stage and high risk. In the UK, it's 25% are in equities, of which I think it's about 11%. And of that 11, very little is in private. So we're really not investing properly.
Can I go to a potentially a more sort of tricky question, which is states that in a sense are certainly run in a different way than Western democracies, shall we say? China, Russia, we could all list the countries in the Middle East and so on. What are the limits? Where are the limits of collaboration? What advice should we be giving to our scientists? I mean, I think it's a particularly pertinent issue in many universities. Where's the acceptable boundaries? Who wants to kick off? Nigel.
Well, I think very simply, it needs to be pre-competitive. Certainly the things I do in China are pre-competitive. And I would not dream of doing anything competitive with them. Biotechnology is booming in China, absolutely booming. I visited a company over there. It was only 3 years old, and it had marketing approval for a monoclonal antibody. In the US or in Europe, that would take 7 years. They'd done it in 3 from nothing, from an empty field. Yeah, I think pre-competitive is fine. Anything competitive, you need to be extremely careful.
George.
Yeah, so I'll share a story with you. When the president, when David Cameron and George Osborne were in office, do you remember Osborne was very pro-China, and they had a state visit from the Chinese president, big sort of Shangri-La at the Guildhall, and I was wheeled out, much to my surprise, as the sort of bushy-tailed Minister for Life Science to do the warm-up talk on genomics. We just launched the genomics program to global acclaim, and in the speech that my civil servants wrote me, it said, I'd like to pay tribute to the Beijing Genomics Institute. And the morning of the speech, they said, Minister, we're going to take that bit out. We've just been told by Genomics England that we're running at about 5 hack attacks a week from the Beijing Genomics Institute. So I said, I know you all share our deep interest in biosecurity. And I think there's a really important point. The reason I started tonight, Sally, with the story I told is that I think, to me, what's so exciting about science is that it's focused on an inspiring end goal, it's disciplined, it's imaginative, it's creative. And I think the science community have sort of lost the knack of telling a story. And I think we've got to tell a story about science being the thing that unshackled millions of people in Europe from the tyranny of church and superstition. It's science that's liberated people from disease. And I think the values of science are really key. And I think we should be, as China starts to dominate, we need to be really careful. If we're not careful, they will literally dominate in genomics and informatics and, elbow us out. And I think we've got to stand up and say, no, there are some values in this. Absolutely, there are values in how you regulate genetics and how you regulate whether it's food or medicine and data. And one of the things I'm urging the Prime Minister to do in this new regulatory task force is not just, or even bonfire the red tape, it's a distraction for the Daily Mail. We need to be setting the standards for ethics in data and bioscience. And I'd like us to set up a Commonwealth genomics program. Turns out that Australia and Canada are leaders actually alongside us. And we could just stand up and show China, if you're going to do big data and genomics, the values are really important. And someone's got to do it. And you can't pretend. And I think that's a role for Britain.
And how do you, I get that, but how do you make sure that the values of science, as you're describing it, are not just subsumed by the values of the state in terms of China?
In the end, I think the answer to that question is patience. And I deeply believe that if we focus all of this around the patients, patient consent, patient information, turning healthcare from something done to you by a more or less benign health state when it finds it convenient, to health in the 21st century being something that with Fitbits and telephones, we're much more able to do for ourselves. I think that's a really inspiring idea, and it goes with the grain of human instinct. And I think if we build an ethical consent framework around genomics and informatics for medical research, China might set off down the road of rather more totalitarian approach. But in the end, I think human instinct, humanity will be with us. And we may have a bit of a cold war between two different approaches to genomics and informatics. So be it. But I think in the end, we will win it.
Thank you. John Bloomer, you're the only person who hasn't who's put your name rather than it being anonymous. So would you like to ask your question?
Hi, yes, thanks, Sally. Thanks very much, everybody, for the discussion this evening. George, what do you think, and I think Nigel as well, how do you think that we can encourage greater entrepreneurship to grow alongside UK, particularly our UK public science, so that will help us to spur greater innovation and translation? Because I think we've done great science, but we haven't always translated into innovation, have we?
No, we've been quite bad at it. Well, very quickly, it's a great question. There are a few things we could do, I think. One is to, I'm a bit worried. We've gone down a very 1990s model of translational technology transfer with big university offices, negotiating heavily up front. Actually, quite a lot of bioscience discovery can be done. You know, I used to spin out, start a company, put £3 million in, hire 50 people, buy a building. It's very expensive and very risky. These days, quite a lot of that can be done inside the university. So it's kind of spin in. It's the first phase of the development inside the university. So the academics don't have to chuck in their job and their pension. So I think taking out the personal risk so that a postdoc or a professor can say, look, I want to pursue this without jeopardizing my academic career. I think in the end, quite a lot of the risk is personal. Second point, one of the programs I launched as minister is a biomedical catalyst. And the government in 2011 said, we want to create £1 billion fund. And I said, please don't, because what will happen is it'll be gained by the fund managers who couldn't get money any other way. Would you allow me to create a biomedical catalyst where we 50-50 match fund investors? So you de-risk early investment. And we got about 78 investments away in a year. And it really helped to drive investment. So I think de-risking what is that sort of risk pathway is key. And for government to understand that the risk is often personal. And interventions to reduce the personal risk are much cheaper, actually, often than chucking £1 billion funds out there.
Thanks, George. Nigel, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I suspect that's true. My experience is that youngsters, students, my postdocs, are really very keen on doing something entrepreneurial, and they go to all the sessions and the judge. Our students on the Bioscience Enterprise, they win the business competitions. We get a cup every year. So they're very, very keen. I think it could be made easier for them. Certainly the risk for a youngster is much lower than it is for somebody paying a mortgage and those sort of concerns. Yeah, but I agree. I think there's enthusiasm. It could be easier.
I think there is a really important point Nigel makes. There's a new generation. They think differently.
Yeah, and they do.
In sort of conservative policy circles, people are obsessed with owning a house. And of course, that is a wonderful thing. But I think there's a generation coming for whom actually they might aspire to own a business before they own a house. And that's a very different mindset. And I think we need to think, one of the things that Cambridge has been quite good at in the last few years is creating much more affordable housing for young families working in Cambridge in science, and thinking about the life cycle and supporting those young entrepreneurs, I think is really important, because if we don't, we're going to create an economy where they just can't afford to take the risk.
bioscience hubs, which in a sense is sort of very core to the Cambridge experience, I suppose, which cluster expertise. We've talked a bit about them already. Do they actually change how research is done, Nigel?
Yeah, I'm sure they do, because people want to collaborate. They want to work with other scientists. Bringing people together kicks off ideas. I worked in Unilever in Holland for several years, and we had a consultant, and he gave us a presentation, and his thesis was that one of the most important things is where you put the coffee machine, because people weep when they go to the coffee machine, and they talk and they kick ideas off each other.
Yeah.
And so in terms of productivity, his thesis was the most important thing is to put it in a place where people can get to easily, come together and talk.
Yeah.
And that's basically what these bioincubators do.
Yeah.
So I'm sure they're a good thing.
Yeah.
And they're certainly accessible.
Yeah.
I think the key word in the science park is park. And one of the reasons Babraham is such an exciting campus is that it is genuinely a park, right? It's got core science in the core labs, and then this ecosystem of little flexi space, middle space, and big company space, and a park and trees. It's a beautiful place to go. And that was Cambridge's USP. And one of the things we've got to make sure is that we don't turn it into such a car park that you can never enjoy it. Cambridge works when people can walk around and cycle around and interact and engage. And I think quite a lot of clusters, and Norwich is making a mistake if it's going to build a housing estate around the Norwich Research Park and then kill the spirit. It needs to be a bicycling, cycling, walking, creative space where people can come together.
Yeah.
This is a great one for you, Nigel, and I can see Rod's on the call as well, so he'll be amused by this. Suppose you were a member of the college responsible for the college's endowment. Would you invest in biotech?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Because I was actually.
I know, that's why I asked you. That's precisely why I'm asking you.
And I can't actually, to be honest, I don't think it was invested in biotech, but I think it definitely should be. I'll be completely open. I'm not either, but I don't really understand why.
Probably because of what George explained about the funds, really. It doesn't work.
Well, the one problem with biotech is it's all very long term. So when I was involved in spin out, I'd find myself in these pitches, and you'd pitch up with some biotech idea, and you'd say, well, it'll take about 5 or 6 years before we see any money. And then a guy from some software startup would stand up and he said, well, it could be 3 or 4 weeks before we see some income. And you could feel the whole interest turning off. I think some way needs to be found to make that timescale more bearable.
I'm going to give both of you the same final question, which is quite a broad brush run, really. So it allows you to tell us really what you think, which is, what are the biggest challenges, but I'll add to that opportunities, I guess, for facing the life sciences today, and will they be the same in 10 years' time? So in other words, describe for us what could be for the next 10 years and what you'd like to see, I guess, at the end of 10 years, and what might stop us getting there. Let me start with you, Nigel, then I'll come to George to finish.
Oh, gosh, now that really is a tough question. One of the things I've been working on for the past 5 years is how can we preserve cells? Cells are going to be used in therapy. How can we preserve them so we can move them around the country, take them to places where they're needed, and they're stable? It's been absolutely strange to find that exactly the same problem exists with the Pfizer vaccine. It had to be shifted around at -80, which is very inhospitable. So I think making access to these products easier is going to be an issue.
Good point. George?
2 things. One problem, 2 solutions. When I was made Minister for Life Science, the first thing everyone asked me was, what are life sciences? And it's a sensible question, actually. And the life science industry, people think of pharmaceuticals. And I think the danger for the life science industry is that it's locked into a very, very expensive drug development model. Actually, what it's got to do is got to go in 2 directions. One, the science of life, food, medicine, energy, the underpinning systems biological systems that underpin the cycle of life. Because in the end, climate change, decarbonisation, sustainable growth is the absolute key. And a broader approach. So I wanted to set up a bioscience, bioeconomy strategy, because it's where food and medicine and energy meet. When I was trade envoy, I brought delegations back to sit in a Formula One Lotus in Norfolk, driven by low carbon Formula One biofuel made by genetically modified bugs breaking down agricultural waste. That's life sciences. And at the other end, the life science industry's got to get off just making expensive drugs the NHS can't afford and help us prevent disease and use digital and earlier biomarkers and prevention and start to reduce the cost curve. And that's going to require place-based approaches, new partnerships, not just drugs, but digital, med tech and health tech. And that is quite a different paradigm. And we're locked into quite a big model of command and control, heavy NHS, top-down medicalization and pharma drugs.
Yeah. And
we need to move quickly to tackling obesity, chronic disease, cardiorespiratory comorbidities by healthier approaches to people's living practices in places.
Thank you very much indeed, both of you. Thank you for your sort of your energy and your enthusiasm, actually, because it's kind of uplifting and certainly makes me feel optimistic that there are positive ways ahead, which maybe some of us at the moment feel a bit more gloomy about. So thank you very much indeed, and thanks very much everybody for joining us. See you probably next week, Ashley, but thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.